Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Buffs and nerfs coming in for healers on October 30th with the weekly reset, and here we're going to go over all of them. Starting off, we've got Resto Druids having Call the Elder Druid. This is the Heart of the Wild buff whenever you're going into a combat shapeshift form. So if you go into cat form, for example, you're getting your Heart of the Wild buff. They're increasing that to 15 seconds instead of the previous 10-second duration. And Dream of Cenarius, now causing Wrath and Shred to transfer 100% of damage instead of 50% of damage done into healing. And Starfire and Swipe to transfer 50% of their damage instead of 33%. So actually working to make a lot of the cat weaving things possible. You might have been seeing a number of Resto Druids in the MDI for time trials and things like that, where it was doing really well when everyone's 639 doing like 10s and 12s and stuff, right? Where you're fully geared. But there's been so many times where you just didn't have the opportunity to actually shift into cat form with how GCD intensive it's been for the spec to actually put up their healing. So I feel like this helps, but it's kind of one side of the equation. It's still really GCD intensive to set up HOTS that don't really do much to crank out huge regrowth healing. So it's like part of the equation they made better. But I think the rest of the equation might be like redesigns that you have to work on. But hey, Mistweaver Monk got a healing buff, which I think is actually quite needed. Not so much, not massively, I would say, for like an M+ environment, but definitely for like a raid environment. It's the output healer that, you know, is kind of just bringing okay output, not anything insane. But what also further helps M+, having things like Awakened Jadefire causing Spinning Crane Kick to transfer 110% of your damage done instead of 90% into healing. Jadefire Teachings increasing Ancient Teachings by an additional 160% instead of 140. Rushing Wind kicks damage increased by 150%, and the Rushing Wind's now increasing Renewing Mist healing by 100%. Yu'lon's Whisper healing increased by 400%. Wow. And Jade Bond now increasing Mastery Gustive Mist healing by 20% instead of 60%. So an overall healing buff, but also kind of compensating for the insanity that was happening with the heavy Mastery build. I believe Meg had posted about some of like the logs were just the 15-20% of something like that of their overall healing was just the mastery triggers thanks to things like Jade Bond. And so they even say, they're like, we're happy that it exists, it's powerful, and it's in the right conditions, but its output has been above what we're comfortable, decreasing the effectiveness of this build without breaking the cooldown reduction gameplay to keep the feel the same, compensating baseline to shrink the difference between this high-end output and regular play. So I like this, and then honestly, it's been more encouraging for me to like want to get back into playing more Mistweaver as well, since the spec has really like not super shined in raids really at the moment. It's gotten continued buffs and continued like iteration upon it to make the gameplay feel good, but on a lot of times when something's like flavor of the month, everyone rushes to it and then they kind of move on to the next big thing. So Mistweaver, I'm pretty excited to kind of get back into, because I think it's gonna be really, really fun to be able to play. Paladin, this is just crazy to me. Holy Paladin's mana has been plentiful enough to use Beacon more often than we would like throughout a raid encounter. We'd like the use of Beacon of Virtue to influence mana decisions more heavily. Beacon cost 5% base mana, was 4. Holy Shock now costs 2.8% instead of 2.6%. I can't fathom why they nerf Paladin. At least in this way, like it's so silly, man. I gotta tell you, Paladin's a spec that like doesn't have a great mana dump. I don't even feel like there's moments where, you know, overusing Virtue makes you feel so insanely powerful and so like high output in, you know, in raids or whatever it is, right? You still have to spend mana to build up holy power that also, and to spend that holy power on abilities that also cost mana. Like, I don't get it. Like, you'll like press your regular buttons and like just you know. I swear, like they need to bring back like Holy Radiance or something from back in the day so they have like a proper mana dump or something like that. I swear, the standard that Holy Paladins get held to is like so different than most other healers. And I don't know, it's related to Devo Aura. I feel like everybody would be fine dropping, you know, like these DRs that certain healers bring and others don't bring or something, so your output can just honestly feel on par. Throughout this expansion, it definitely feels like Paladin's Devo Aura is like their other standard that they gotta get held to, and that honestly just makes healers feel weaker as a result. You know, it feels like you're just not as strong, especially when you're having to play in a 5-man environment by yourself, and you know, you're not having as powerful of an effect from it as you would have from like a raid perspective. You know, honestly, I just can't understand it. It's also weird coming from playing Disc and I go play Paladin and I have to like really stress about my mana and think about my mana a lot more. Even when I play like Totemic Shaman and everything, like, yeah, I have to think about my mana, but I swear it usually feels worse when I play Paladin over anybody else. Super strange. Hey, I'm shocked to see Disc buffs coming into the mix. We're increasing Disc's direct healing throughput, to help in situations where no enemy target is present to trigger Atonement. I think everybody knows what the Disc Priest dev did, which dungeon they did. They did City of Threads, and they fought like the Beetle. And they're like, I can't heal anybody. And then, then this is the result. As actually hilarious. We'd also like to nudge Disc's performance up in raids, particularly for Oracle. Huzzah! So in order to do that, they're increasing Powered Radiance healing. Okay, cool. Flash heal increased by 15%. All right, cool. The Premonition of Piety increases healing done by 20%, was 15%. Preemptive Care increases atonement duration by 4 seconds, was 3 seconds. So, yeah, having some Radiances to cast on your allies, you know, make it a little bit stronger. Cool, I guess. Radiance is really weak right now, and so I don't think 20% is going to be some huge thing, but hey, I won't say no to it. The Flash Heal, kind of the same story. I think this might help a little bit more as well in raids where you can actually have some reasonable spot heal, because I think the shield value is so much higher than flash heals these days for Disc. Part of that is due to like Mastery, 4-set bonus, Wheel and Woe, you know, tons of other modifiers that you have on hand to affect it. So it's kind of understandable, but I like that they're bringing it up. Piety getting its healing done increased a little bit further is also nice, but I feel like the spec is just lacking the burst. I don't know how else to describe it. It's really difficult to make like 2 different distinct builds with hero talents and also make them feel good and also relate them in some decent capacity to Holy Priest at the exact same time. So really the issue with Oracle in general is never really been the atonement uptime. Like having more atonement duration is cool and all, but like you're living and dying by your ramps output. And so, yeah, having really high overheal transfer rates is going to be really strong. But if it doesn't do as much burst as something like Voidweaver, then you don't run it at the end of the day. Like, that's the end of the equation. So, hey, I won't say no to any Disc buffs or anything like that. It just didn't really happen in the way that I expected. So, I would say from my perspective, it doesn't really change anything I'm doing as I progress Mythic Anzarek right now playing Disc. And my spot healing just is going to feel slightly better. And then I don't really think this is going to move the needle too much for Piety, at least until we hit max gear. Like, if you were raiding Heroic and you're in a guild that's doing like normal Heroic and you kind of just farm it now, I would probably give Oracle a shot in that environment, because you could basically set up all of your atonements, especially in larger raid sizes. And then, you know, once you hit Piety, and it doesn't matter if you overheal or something, when you hit a decent ramp, you're just going to transfer all that healing to your allies. Currently in like Mythic Raid Prog, I would say Disc feels good in like the first 4 bosses, kind of whatever. On something like Brood Twister, feels pretty poor, and like there's better options for something like Nexus Princess. You could run it on Silken, and then I'm doing it on Anzarek right now, and it's a really big nightmare to play, but it's possible. It's possible, just like a lot of work going into it. There's some very slight changes for Resto, where your Farseer Chain Lightning damage is increased by 40%, and the Lava Burst damage is increased by 15% for your Ancestors. I am amazed that this is actually going into the game, okay? One of the big benefits, really, of playing Farseer was those Chain Lightnings that you were able to put out with your Ancestors. So having a 40% damage buff, this could be the sauce right now. This could be like the really, really big damn setup out of your Ancestors. So I'm really eager to see how this is going to play out in practice. Although, of course, you have to set up a lot of GCDs to actually work Farseer properly. It's really fun, but it also feels like they need to make Healing Rain, I don't know, like 50% longer, 50% longer cooldown, something like that. Like, they need something in the mix to make it a little bit less maintenance-y to work properly. But I do think that the chain lightning damage is going to be huge with the Resto Shaman buffs kind of coming into the mix. Shout out to Kalmazi. Hopefully this stuff is good for Warlock. No idea what any of that means, but that's the changes that we had so far. Biggest surprise, not really seeing any Holy Priest buffs. Problem is, you're playing kind of the same build with Lightweaver in keys and in raids, and the biggest problem with Holy Priest right now is the fact that it just doesn't really handle AoE damage very well in dungeons, and that's really most of what we're experiencing at the moment. It's really super frustrating that like the healing profile doesn't fit very well in what like the dungeons are sort of throwing at you in the mix. Again, kind of surprised they haven't done larger reworks for our Druid to make it way less GCD intensive the way it's been in the past, and like put more power into your healing over time effects that are not, you know, that are not the direct healing out of regrowth or something, or taking that direct healing out of regrowth, putting it into some other stuff. But be interesting to see if there, any other changes are coming in on that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say that we're seeing like huge output out of our Druids in a raiding environment, so I'm not that worried about it in that. Let me see if they've actually fixed the partition for it. Oh, Paladin's actually been popping off with the Lightsmith setup. Ours has been doing the same, but it still feels like you have a lot larger like mana constraints already, at least from what we've been doing throughout progress so far. Mistweaver notably was lagging behind, so hopefully the rebalancing act that they got going on is going to be a net buff for them. It'll be interesting to see on that one. But yeah, there's our coverage so far. Kind of surprised to see any healer changes at all in the mix, and I think the biggest things that they could probably be focusing on right now, honestly, it might just be things that require like larger reworks, because in the case of like Holy Priest, you'd have to be like rebalancing how the output would be balanced between like single target and AoE, for example. Class tree for Priest obviously needs like a lot of work. Our Druids are always going to be hankering for class tree reworks, things like that. Paladin, like, so far I haven't played enough of the reworked talent tree just yet, but it already feels like pretty half-baked with a bunch of dead talent nodes coming into the mix. So really wondering what next that they're going to be able to throw into this to make it feel a little bit better. Glad that the spec feels like it's blasting, but it seems like from what our Paladin has been doing throughout our raid progression is you're kind of just blasting out Avenging Crusader type healing onto like kind of everybody. There's Hammer and Anvil coming in with a Lightsmith tree, which is kind of doing healing to somebody, and you don't have as much agency in terms of who you're actively healing. Some of the times I've enjoyed Paladin the most was when I felt like I had big single target healing, I had big output that I could just slam into one person. I really don't understand why a spec like Paladin, which doesn't have great mana dumps, you could argue that Virtue is the effective sort of mana dump or something like that. But if that's the case, like, make the cooldown longer to constrain it more, for example, because you're building up resources with holy power that also cost mana on top of it. And it's not really like you have these great ways like a monk would to be able to like turn excess mana into huge amounts of output or something along those lines. So it's just very confusing, and obviously it doesn't help the spec when it comes to a key environment either. So those are changes thus far. If you're enjoying this kind of coverage and everything, make sure you're liking and subscribing the video. Big love to our patrons making all this content possible. Thank you for watching, guys. Hope y'all enjoyed it. I'll catch y'all next time.